My name is Jessica Martinez. I'm 38 years old, and I work as a middle school guidance counselor in Dallas, Texas. 3 months ago, my mother-in-law moved into my house, changed every single lock while I was at work, and when I called the police thinking I'd finally get justice, the officer who showed up said something that made my blood run cold. What I did next not only got my house back, but destroyed her reputation in ways she never saw coming. Before I tell you exactly how I turned the tables on this woman who tried to steal my entire life, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Drop your city and state in the comments so I know where you're watching from. Now let me take you back to the beginning of this nightmare, because you need to understand how a sweet courtship turned into a custody battle over my own home. I met David Martinez 7 years ago at a charity fundraiser for children's literacy in downtown Dallas. I was there representing my school, and he was there with his architecture firm that had donated to the cause. I remember watching him across the room, this tall man with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair, listening intently to a young student talk about her favorite books. Most people at these events just nodded politely at the kids, but David was genuinely engaged, asking questions, laughing at her jokes. When our eyes met, he smiled, and I felt something shift in my chest. He walked over, introduced himself, and we spent the next 2 hours talking about everything from childhood dreams to our favorite places in Texas. He told me about growing up in San Antonio, how his father had passed when he was young, and how his mother had worked 2 jobs to put him through college. I admired that about him, the gratitude he showed toward his mother, the respect in his voice when he spoke about her sacrifices. Red flag number 1, looking back now, but at the time it seemed noble. Our courtship was something out of a romance novel. David took me to the Fort Worth stockyards on our first official date, where we watched the cattle drive and ate barbecue at a place his family had been going to for generations. He was a gentleman, opening doors, listening when I talked, asking about my students, and genuinely caring about the answers. On our 3rd date, he took me to the Dallas Arboretum during spring bloom season, and we walked through gardens bursting with tulips and azaleas. He told me that day that he'd been praying for someone like me, someone who cared about making a difference in kids' lives the way his mother had cared about him. I should have heard the comparison then, should have noticed how often he brought her up. But I was falling in love. By month 3, we were inseparable. He'd bring coffee to my school during my planning period, surprise me with flowers on random Wednesdays, text me good morning before I even woke up. My friends loved him, my parents adored him, and I felt like I'd finally found my person after years of disappointing relationships. The proposal came on a cool November evening at Clyde Warren Park. He'd set up a private picnic with all my favorite foods, string lights hanging from the trees, a guitarist playing softly in the background. When he got down on one knee and pulled out his grandmother's ring, I cried so hard I could barely say yes. He told me that his mother would be so happy, that she'd been praying for him to find a good woman, that I was everything she'd hoped for in a daughter-in-law. Again, the excessive mention of his mother, but I brushed it off as sweet devotion. We called her immediately after I said yes, and I could hear the emotion in her voice over the phone. She told me she couldn't wait to welcome me into the family, that she'd been waiting for this moment for years, that she knew I'd take good care of her baby boy. I laughed it off, thinking it was just maternal affection, not the possessive warning it actually was. Our wedding was beautiful, held at a historic chapel in downtown Dallas with 200 guests. My parents had insisted on paying for most of it, which I later realized saved us from having his mother control every detail. She'd tried, though, suggesting I change my dress choice because David's father wouldn't have liked it, insisting on specific flowers because they were her favorites, wanting to approve the menu because David had sensitive tastes. Each time I gently redirected, trying to include her while maintaining my own vision. David supported me in public, but would later say things like his mother just wanted to be involved, that she dreamed of this day for so long, that maybe I could compromise on small things to make her happy. The wedding day itself was perfect, despite her attempts to insert herself into every photo. Her toast that went on for 15 minutes about raising David alone. Her tears during our first dance, that required David to pause and comfort her. I told myself it was just a mother having trouble letting go, that she'd settle down once we were actually married. I thought I'd found forever, a partnership that would weather any storm. How wrong I was. The first few months of marriage were blissful. David and I moved into a beautiful 3-bedroom house in Plano that we'd bought together, both our names on the mortgage and deed. I'd used my entire savings for the down payment, something I'd been building since my first teaching job 12 years ago. The house had a backyard perfect for the family we planned to start, a home office for David's architecture work, and a spare bedroom we'd jokingly called the guest room, but both knew would eventually be a nursery. We hosted dinner parties, took weekend trips to Austin and Houston, talked about our future over morning coffee on the patio. David was attentive, loving, supportive of my career. He'd ask about my challenging students, help me brainstorm intervention strategies, even volunteered to speak to my kids about architecture as a career path. Life felt complete, stable, exactly what I'd always wanted. His mother called frequently, sometimes twice a day, but I didn't think much of it. She lived alone in San Antonio, widowed for over 30 years, and David was her only child. Of course, she'd want to stay connected. Then the changes started, subtle at first, easy to dismiss. About 8 months into our marriage, David began mentioning that his mother was lonely. She'd call during dinner, and he'd step away to talk for an hour. She'd text him constantly throughout the day, and he'd stop mid-conversation with me to respond. When I gently suggested she might benefit from joining a senior center or finding activities in San Antonio, David got defensive. He told me I didn't understand what it was like to be alone, that his mother had sacrificed everything for him, that the least he could do was be available when she needed him. I backed off, not wanting to seem insensitive, but something felt off. The calls increased in frequency and duration. She started having small emergencies that required David to drive 270 miles to San Antonio, sometimes staying overnight. A broken garbage disposal, a weird noise in her attic, feeling dizzy and needing him to take her to the doctor even though tests always came back normal. I rationalized it all. She's getting older, I told myself. She needs help. David is a good son. But my friends started noticing. My best friend Lauren asked why David missed my birthday dinner to fix his mother's internet router, something any technician could have done. My coworker Michelle pointed out that most grown men don't talk to their mothers 3 times a day. I defended him, defended her, not wanting to be the wife who came between a man and his mother. Looking back now, I can see how perfectly she was executing her plan, testing boundaries, seeing how much control she could exert, preparing David to choose her over me when the time came. But I was hopeful, believing that marriage was about compromise, that this would settle into a manageable routine. The second incident happened around our 1-year anniversary. We'd planned a trip to Cancun, booked 6 months in advance, my first real vacation in 3 years. 2 days before we were supposed to leave, David's mother called crying. She'd fallen, she said, hurt her ankle, couldn't walk, needed David immediately. He looked at me with these desperate eyes and said he had to go, that he'd make it quick, be back in time for our flight. I bit my tongue and nodded. He drove to San Antonio that afternoon. When he called me from her house, I could hear her in the background talking normally, walking around clearly fine. When I asked about her ankle, David said she was trying to be brave, pushing through the pain. He didn't come home that night, or the next day. We missed our flight. He finally returned 3 days later, sheepish and apologetic, saying his mother had really needed him and he'd lost track of time. I was furious, but when I tried to express my feelings, he turned it around on me. Was I really so selfish that I'd begrudge him caring for his elderly mother? Did I not understand that she'd raised him alone? That she had no one else? I ended up apologizing, which I now recognize as classic manipulation, but at the time I genuinely felt guilty. The pattern emerged clearly after that. Every important event in our marriage, his mother had a crisis. My work promotion celebration, she needed him to help her sort through storage. our friend's wedding where we were in the wedding party. She had chest pains that turned out to be anxiety. My father's birthday dinner, she couldn't breathe and required an emergency room visit where doctors found nothing wrong. Each time David chose her. Each time I swallowed my disappointment. My parents started asking if everything was okay in my marriage. My mother gently suggested couples counseling. I insisted everything was fine, that David was just close with his mother, that it would ease up eventually. Meanwhile, the calls from his mother to me started. Sweet at first, asking about my day, my students, recipes I might recommend. Then subtle digs. David mentioned you made chicken last night, but you know he doesn't like poultry, right? I saw your photo from the barbecue. That dress is very bold for someone your age. David used to love when I made his Sunday breakfast. Does he still get that at home? Each comment designed to make me feel inadequate, like I didn't know my own husband, like I was failing at being a proper wife. My friends and family noticed the change in me. I became defensive, anxious, constantly checking my phone for messages from David or his mother. I started second-guessing my cooking, my clothes, my housekeeping. Lauren confronted me one day at lunch, told me I seemed like a shadow of myself, asked what was really going on. I broke down and told her everything. She looked at me with such concern and said this wasn't normal, that a healthy mother-in-law relationship didn't involve daily interference and constant criticism. She suggested I talk to David seriously, set boundaries, maybe even consider counseling. I promised I would, but when I tried to bring it up with David that evening, he shut me down immediately. His mother was going through a hard time, he said. She was aging, facing her mortality, realizing she'd spent her whole life alone. Could I please just be patient and kind? But what happened next changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning in March, unseasonably warm for Dallas. I'd left for work at 7 a.m. like always, kissed David goodbye, reminded him I had a late faculty meeting and wouldn't be home until 6. My day was packed with student sessions, a particularly difficult case involving a freshman with suicidal ideation that required immediate intervention and parent conferences that lasted hours. I was emotionally drained, looking forward to coming home, making something simple for dinner, maybe watching a movie with David to decompress. I pulled into our driveway at 6:15 p.m. and immediately noticed David's truck wasn't there, which was odd because he usually worked from home on Tuesdays. I walked up to the front door, reached for my keys, slid the house key into the lock, and it didn't fit. I tried again, thinking I had the wrong key, but no. Someone had changed the lock. My heart started racing. Had we been robbed? I ran to the back door, tried that key. Same thing, changed lock. I peered through the windows and could see all our furniture still there, nothing obviously disturbed. But something was very wrong. I called David immediately. He answered on the 4th ring, sounding distracted. I asked where he was, told him about the locks, said I couldn't get into our house. There was a long pause. Then he said, in this quiet, defeated voice, that his mother had changed the locks, that she'd moved in that morning, that he'd tried to stop her, but she'd insisted that he was currently at a hotel because he didn't know what else to do. I stood there in my own driveway, phone pressed to my ear, unable to process what he'd just said. His mother had changed the locks on my house, the house I'd paid the down payment for, the house with both our names on the deed, and David had just let it happen? I told him to get home immediately, that this was insane, that we needed to call the police. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes, that we'd figure it out, but his voice lacked conviction. I hung up and called 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. I told the operator that someone had broken into my house and changed the locks, that I was the legal owner and couldn't get inside. She dispatched an officer, told me to wait outside, not to confront anyone. I paced the driveway, my mind spinning. How had this happened? How had David allowed his mother to literally lock me out of my own home? What was her plan? 10 minutes later, a squad car pulled up and Officer Rodriguez stepped out. He was older, maybe late 50s, with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. I explained the situation, showed him my driver's license with this address, said my name was on the deed, that my mother-in-law had somehow changed the locks while I was at work. He knocked on the door. To my shock, David's mother, Diane Martinez, answered like she owned the place. She was 68 years old but carried herself with this imperious confidence, gray hair perfectly styled, wearing one of her church dresses like she was receiving guests. Officer Rodriguez identified himself and asked what was going on. Diane smiled sweetly and said there must be some misunderstanding, that this was her son's house, that she'd moved in to help out because Jessica, she gestured at me like I was a stranger, had been neglecting the home and her son's needs. I started to protest, but Officer Rodriguez held up his hand. He asked to see documentation of ownership. I pulled up the deed on my phone, showing both David and my name as joint owners. Diane countered that her son had invited her, that she had every right to be there, that I was overreacting to a simple family matter. Then Officer Rodriguez said something that made my blood run cold. He looked at me with these apologetic eyes and said that because this was a domestic situation between family members, and because Diane had been let in by her son who was a legal resident, this was technically a civil matter, not a criminal one. He couldn't force her to leave or make her change the locks back. He suggested I contact a lawyer, maybe stay somewhere else tonight, let the court sort it out. I felt like the ground had opened beneath me. The police couldn't help me? I was being locked out of my own house and there was no immediate recourse? Diane stood in my doorway with this triumphant smile, knowing she'd won this round. Officer Rodriguez gave me his card, told me to call if things escalated, but essentially left me standing in my driveway with nowhere to go. David pulled up just as the officer was leaving. He looked terrible, exhausted and conflicted, but not nearly angry enough at what his mother had done. I demanded answers. How did this happen? When did she get keys? How did she change the lock so fast? David admitted that she'd been planning this for weeks, that she'd told him she was lonely in San Antonio, that she wanted to move in with us just temporarily, that when he'd hesitated, she'd cried and said she had nowhere else to go, that she'd raised him alone, and this was how he repaid her. He'd apparently given her a spare key 2 weeks ago, thinking she just wanted to visit while we were at work, not understanding she planned a hostile takeover. This morning, she'd shown up with a locksmith claiming to be the homeowner and changed every lock in the house. David said he'd tried calling me, but I'd been in student sessions with my phone off, tried texting, but I hadn't seen them, didn't know what to do, so he'd just left. If this is resonating with you, if you've ever felt betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect you, please hit that like button and subscribe. Your support means everything. I asked David why he hadn't physically stopped the locksmith, called the police himself, done anything to prevent this invasion. He said his mother had threatened to tell everyone he was an abusive son who abandoned his elderly mother, that she'd ruin his reputation in his professional community, that she'd contest his father's life insurance policy that had funded David's college education by claiming he'd manipulated her. I stared at this man I'd married, this man who was supposed to be my partner, my protector, and realized he was terrified of his own mother. Not respectful, not devoted, but genuinely afraid of what she could do to him. Diane appeared in the doorway again, told David to come. Inside said he must be hungry, and she'd made his favorite dinner. She looked at me and said with fake concern that maybe I should stay with my parents tonight, give everyone time to cool down, that we could discuss living arrangements in the morning, like civilized adults. Living arrangements, in my own house, that I'd bought with my own money. I refused to leave without a fight. I told David to choose right now, me or his mother, our marriage or her manipulation. He looked between us, this agonized expression on his face, and started crying. He said he couldn't choose, that he loved us both, that maybe we could all live together and make it work, that his mother wouldn't stay long. Diane interrupted, said she'd actually decided to stay permanently, that the house was plenty big enough, that David needed her because clearly I wasn't meeting his needs, given how often he called her crying about our marriage problems. That was news to me. I'd thought we were happy aside from her interference. David wouldn't meet my eyes. I realized then that he'd been complaining to her about me, feeding her ammunition, creating this narrative that I was inadequate so she could justify her invasion. I called my best friend Lauren, who arrived within 15 minutes and took me to her apartment. I spent that night crying, rage texting David, trying to understand how my life had imploded so completely in one day. Lauren helped me think strategically. I needed a lawyer immediately, she said. I needed documentation of everything. I needed to protect my assets and my rights. She was right, but I was so emotionally devastated I could barely function. My husband had chosen his mother over me. The police had essentially told me I had no recourse. A woman who wasn't on the deed had taken over my house, and I was the one displaced. The injustice of it burned through me like acid. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. I contacted 3 divorce attorneys, trying to find someone who could help me immediately. The first 2 were sympathetic, but said property disputes during separation could take months. The third attorney, Margaret Brennan, a sharp woman in her 50s with silver hair and steel in her eyes, listened to my whole story and then asked me one question that changed everything. Did I have proof I'd paid the down payment? I said yes, I had bank statements, wire transfer receipts, closing documents, everything. She smiled and said we had a case for separate property claim, that in Texas, property acquired during marriage with separate funds could be argued as separate property, not community, especially if I could prove the down payment came entirely from my premarital savings. She said we'd need to move fast, file for emergency relief, potentially get a restraining order against Diane, but it was possible. Hope flickered for the first time since this nightmare started. Margaret filed paperwork that afternoon, emergency motion, for restoration of possession, request for temporary restraining order, petition for divorce, citing insupportability, and a separate property claim on the house. We scheduled a hearing for the following week, expedited due to the emergency nature of my situation. Margaret warned me that David would be served papers, that things would get ugly, that Diane would fight back hard. I told her I didn't care, that I wanted my house back, that I wanted this woman out of my life. Margaret also suggested I document everything, get witness statements from friends and family about Diane's behavior, gather evidence of the property's purchase. I spent the next 3 days in Lauren's spare room, building my case, contacting my parents who were horrified and immediately offered financial support, talking to my coworker Michelle, who'd witnessed David canceling on me repeatedly for his mother's fake emergencies. David called constantly, begging me to drop the legal action, saying we could work this out as a family, that his mother was just scared and lonely and didn't mean any harm. I recorded every call, as Margaret had instructed. In one particularly damning conversation, David admitted his mother had planned this for months, that she'd been saving money from her Social Security to hire the locksmith, that she'd told him she deserved to live in a nice house after years of sacrifice, that she'd convinced him I was trying to separate them and this was her way of protecting their relationship. I asked if he understood she'd committed illegal eviction, that she'd essentially stolen my home. He got quiet and then said maybe I was being dramatic, that she just wanted to be close to her son in her final years, that I was being selfish. That word again, selfish, for wanting to live in the house I'd purchased. The harassment started almost immediately. Diane had my phone number from when David and I first got engaged, and she began texting me. First trying to be conciliatory, saying we could be like mother and daughter if I'd just give her a chance, that she'd help with cooking and cleaning, that I'd appreciate having her around. When I didn't respond, the messages turned nasty. She called me a gold digger who'd trapped her son into marriage, said I was probably cheating because what kind of wife doesn't satisfy her husband enough to keep him from needing his mother, claimed I'd never appreciated the sacrifices she'd made. I saved every message, forwarded them all to Margaret. My attorney was thrilled, said this demonstrated harassment and could strengthen our restraining order request. The text messages became increasingly unhinged as the days progressed. Diane would send them at all hours, 3 a.m, during my workday, late at night when she knew I was trying to sleep at Lauren's apartment. One message read that I was the reason her blood pressure was high, that if she had a stroke, it would be my fault for stressing her out. Another claimed that David had confessed to her that he'd never really loved me, that he'd only married me because I'd pressured him, which was completely false. She sent me photos of herself in my house, sitting in my favorite chair, using my kitchen, sleeping in my bed, like she was taunting me with what she'd taken. Each photo felt like a violation. This woman inhabiting my space, touching my things, living my life while I was displaced. She also started a social media campaign against me. Diane had Facebook friends from her church, her book club, her various community groups in San Antonio, and she posted long sob stories about how her ungrateful daughter-in-law had thrown her out after she'd graciously offered to help with housework. She painted herself as a victim, a poor elderly widow who'd given everything to raise her son only to be rejected by his selfish wife. People who didn't know me started commenting with support for her, calling me terrible names, saying younger women today had no respect for elders. Some even sent me friend requests just to send hateful messages. I had to make my social media private, block dozens of strangers, report harassment to the platforms. It was exhausting and humiliating. What bothered me most was that Diane had positioned herself as the wronged party when she was the one who'd committed illegal acts. She'd taken over my property without permission, changed my locks, stolen my belongings, and yet somehow she'd crafted a narrative where I was the villain. It showed a level of manipulation and delusion that was genuinely frightening. Margaret warned me not to engage, not to respond to any of her posts or messages, that anything I said could be twisted and used against me. So I stayed silent publicly while documenting everything privately, building an evidence file that grew thicker every day. Meanwhile, I was still locked out of my own house. I'd been staying with Lauren for 5 days, living out of a suitcase, unable to access my clothes, my personal items, my documents. David had met me once at a coffee shop to give me some things I'd requested, but Diane had apparently gone through everything first, keeping items she deemed inappropriate or that belonged to David's family. She'd kept my grandmother's pearls, claiming they were community property. She'd kept photo albums from my childhood, saying the house needed proper family pictures. She'd even kept my professional certificates and diplomas, stating she was redecorating my home office into a craft room for herself. The audacity was breathtaking. The hearing arrived faster than I expected. Margaret had prepared me thoroughly, coached me on staying calm, focusing on facts, not letting emotion undermine my credibility. We walked into the courtroom, and there sat David with his own attorney, a slick guy named Preston, who specialized in protecting men's assets during divorce. And next to David, sitting like she had every right to be there, was Diane, wearing a navy suit and pearls, looking every bit the respectable elderly lady who couldn't possibly be a home invader. The judge, Honorable Patricia Simmons, was a woman in her early 60s with a reputation for not tolerating nonsense. Margaret had told me Judge Simmons had dealt with her own difficult mother-in-law and might be sympathetic. Margaret presented our case methodically. She showed the deed with my name on it, the bank statements proving my separate funds paid the down payment, the purchase agreement, closing documents, mortgage statements showing I'd made every payment from my account, while David contributed to other household expenses. She presented the timeline of Diane changing the locks, showed the text messages between David and me where he admitted what happened, played recordings of David admitting his mother had planned this invasion. She showed Diane's harassing text messages to me, proved I'd been constructively evicted from my own home, argued that Diane had no legal right to be in the property, and her presence constituted criminal trespass that police had failed to address properly. It was damning, comprehensive, irrefutable. Preston tried to argue that as a marital residence, David had equal rights to invite anyone to live there, that Diane was just an invited guest, that I was overreacting to a family disagreement. Judge Simmons cut him off. She asked directly if Diane's name appeared anywhere on the deed or mortgage. Preston admitted it didn't. Judge Simmons asked if I, as a legal owner, had consented to Diane living there or changing the locks. Preston said no, but claimed David's consent was sufficient. Judge Simmons asked to see documentation that David had legal authority to unilaterally invite someone to permanently reside in a jointly owned property without the other owner's consent. Preston couldn't provide any because it didn't exist. The judge looked irritated. Then Margaret called me to the stand. I testified about the down payment from my premarital savings, about being locked out of my home, about Diane's harassment, about David's admission that this was planned. I took my time, explaining to Judge Simmons how I'd worked as a guidance counselor for 12 years, saving diligently, living frugally, dreaming of homeownership as a symbol of stability and independence. I described opening my savings account the month I started my first teaching job, how I'd deposited money every single paycheck, how I'd sacrificed vacations and luxuries to build that down payment. I showed the judge my savings account statements going back years, the steady growth, the wire transfer of $48,000 from my personal account to the title company for closing. I explained that David and I had agreed I'd use my savings for the down payment while he'd contribute to monthly expenses and improvements. I showed our text messages from before we bought the house where we'd discussed this arrangement, where David had thanked me for making homeownership possible for us. I testified about choosing the house together, about the excitement of finding this perfect 3-bedroom in Plano, about imagining our future there. Then I described the crushing betrayal of coming home to changed locks, of being treated like an intruder in the home I'd purchased with money I'd earned through years of hard work. Preston cross-examined me, trying to make me seem like a vindictive wife who wanted to punish her husband's poor, elderly mother. But I stayed calm, stuck to facts, refused to take the bait. He asked if David and I were having marital problems before Diane moved in. I said we'd had issues related to his mother's interference, but nothing that justified what had happened. I gave specific examples: the missed anniversary trip, the canceled birthday dinner, the constant emergency calls that always turned out to be nothing. I explained how I'd tried to be understanding, how I'd encouraged David's relationship with his mother, how I'd invited her for holidays and family events, how I genuinely tried to build a relationship with her despite her subtle hostility. Preston asked if I'd ever tried to prevent David from seeing his mother. I said no, never. I'd encouraged their relationship, just wanted healthy boundaries. I explained what I meant by healthy boundaries: visits scheduled in advance rather than constant demands, emergencies that were actual emergencies rather than manipulation tactics, respect for our marriage and our time together. Preston asked if I'd considered that Diane was lonely and needed help. I looked him dead in the eye and said plenty of elderly people need help without committing home invasion, without harassing their daughters-in-law, without destroying their sons' marriages. I said there were senior centers, community programs, church groups, therapy, legitimate ways to address loneliness that didn't involve taking over someone else's property. Margaret then called David to the stand, which surprised me. She asked him point blank if he'd given his mother permission to change the locks. He hesitated, looked at Diane, then admitted yes. Margaret asked if he'd consulted with me first, knowing I was a legal owner of the property. He said no. She asked if he understood that changing locks without my consent was potentially illegal. He said he hadn't thought about it that way. He was just trying to help his mother. Margaret asked him to describe the marital problems he'd apparently told his mother about. David stammered, said things like, I worked too much, didn't cook his favorite meals enough, didn't appreciate how hard his mother had worked to raise him. Judge Simmons actually rolled her eyes. Then Margaret asked the question that broke the case wide open. She asked David if his mother had ever discussed moving in before she actually did it. David said yes, many times over the past year. Margaret asked if he'd told her it wasn't possible without discussing it with me first. David admitted he'd told his mother she could move in any time, that he'd handle me, that I'd come around eventually. Margaret asked if he had any documentation of that promise. David's attorney objected, but Judge Simmons overruled, wanting to hear the answer. David admitted he'd texted his mother several times, saying the house would be hers whenever she wanted it, that he'd make sure I accepted the arrangement. Margaret entered the text messages into evidence, obtained through discovery. The courtroom went silent as Judge Simmons read messages where David had literally conspired with his mother to take over my house. Diane couldn't help herself. She stood up from the gallery and started speaking without being called, telling Judge Simmons that I'd been a terrible wife, that David called her crying regularly, that any good mother would protect her son from a woman like me. Judge Simmons told her to sit down and be quiet, or she'd be removed from the courtroom. Diane kept talking, saying she'd raised David alone, worked her fingers to the bone, deserved a comfortable home in her old age, that I was young and could start over, but she couldn't. Judge Simmons signaled the bailiff, who escorted a protesting Diane out of the courtroom. The optics couldn't have been worse for David's case. His mother had just demonstrated exactly the kind of entitled, unhinged behavior I'd been describing. Judge Simmons took a brief recess, came back and delivered her ruling. She granted my emergency motion, ordering immediate restoration of my possession of the property. She issued a temporary restraining order against Diane, prohibiting her from coming within 500 feet of the house or contacting me in any way. She ordered David to facilitate my immediate re-entry into the home and to ensure Diane removed all her belongings within 24 hours. She stated clearly that Diane had no legal right to be in the property, that changing the locks constituted illegal eviction, and that if Diane didn't comply, she'd face contempt charges and potential criminal prosecution. Judge Simmons also set a trial date for the divorce and property division, but indicated she was strongly leaning toward granting me separate property status on the house, given the evidence of my separate funds purchasing it. The look on David's face was pure devastation. Diane, who'd been allowed back in for the ruling, started screaming at the judge that this was unfair, that I'd manipulated everyone, that she had nowhere to go. Judge Simmons calmly told her that her housing situation was not the court's concern, that she should have considered that before illegally occupying someone else's property. Bailiffs escorted Diane out as she hurled insults at me, at the judge, at the entire legal system. David just sat there looking defeated, finally understanding perhaps that his mother had destroyed his marriage and possibly his future. Margaret and I left the courthouse victorious, but exhausted. She told me to get a police escort to the house, document everything when I returned, change all the locks immediately, and keep detailed records of anything Diane had damaged or stolen. I called Officer Rodriguez, who'd given me his card that first night, explained the court order, and asked for assistance. He agreed to meet me at the house at 4 p.m. I also called a locksmith, scheduled them for 4:30 p.m. Then I called my parents, who'd been waiting anxiously for news, and told them I'd won. My mother cried with relief. My father said he was proud of me for fighting back, that he'd never liked how David let his mother control everything. When I arrived at the house with Officer Rodriguez, David was there, looking miserable. Diane had apparently already left, taken away by her sister who'd driven up from San Antonio. The house was trashed. Diane had gone through everything in a rage, broken dishes, torn pictures off walls, dumped drawers onto the floor. She'd spray-painted ungrateful on the wall of what had been my office. She'd cut up several of my dresses, the nice ones I wore to work. She'd poured bleach on the bedroom carpet. She'd taken or destroyed anything of value she could find, including my grandmother's pearls, my laptop, even food from the refrigerator. Officer Rodriguez documented everything, took photos, said I could press charges for criminal mischief and theft. I told him I absolutely would. Walking through my violated home felt surreal, like a crime scene from one of those true crime shows I used to watch before living through my own nightmare. In the kitchen, every dish I'd carefully selected was shattered on the floor, glass and ceramic shards covering the tile. She'd emptied the refrigerator, not just taking food but pouring milk down the sink, smashing eggs against the walls, grinding produce into the countertops. The stench was overwhelming. In the living room, family photos were torn from frames, my face scratched out with what looked like a key or knife. She'd overturned furniture, slashed the couch cushions, pulled books from shelves, and ripped pages out of my favorites. My bedroom was the worst. She'd gone through my closet systematically, cutting sleeves off blazers, pouring bleach on anything nice, leaving only damaged clothes behind. My jewelry box was empty. Not just my grandmother's pearls, but everything. Costume jewelry, sentimental pieces from high school, my wedding ring from David, which I'd removed and stored there. She dumped my makeup and skincare products into the bathtub, mixed them together in a disgusting soup. She'd written on the bathroom mirror with lipstick, words I won't repeat, but that made Officer Rodriguez wince and take extra photos for evidence. The home office destruction felt particularly personal. This was my sanctuary where I graded papers, planned lessons, decompressed from difficult days with students. She'd spray-painted that word, ungrateful, in huge red letters. Across the wall, I'd painted a peaceful blue. She'd destroyed my filing cabinet, scattering confidential student records across the floor, which was actually a potential VERPA violation that could have endangered my career. She'd smashed my desktop computer, the one with years of lesson plans and student tracking data. She'd torn down my diplomas, bent the frames, cracked the glass, threw them in the trash. It was vindictive. Calculated destruction meant to hurt me in every possible way. David stood in the doorway of each room, watching me discover the damage, crying softly, saying he was sorry over and over. But sorry doesn't fix broken things. Sorry doesn't restore stolen heirlooms. Sorry doesn't undo the violation of having someone destroy your safe space. I asked him where he'd been while his mother did all this. He admitted he'd been at work, that she'd called him afterward bragging about what she'd done, that he'd rushed home but she was already gone. I asked why he hadn't called me, warned me, tried to stop her in any way. He had no answer that made sense. David tried to apologize, said his mother had lost control, that he'd pay for the damages, that maybe we could still work things out. I looked at this man I'd married, this man who'd let his mother destroy our home and our marriage, and felt nothing but disgust. I told him I wanted him out too, that as far as I was concerned, our marriage was over the moment he chose her over me. He started crying, begging for another chance, swearing he'd cut his mother off completely. I asked why I should believe him now when he'd had 1,000 chances to set boundaries before and never did. He had no answer. Officer Rodriguez quietly suggested David should leave before the locksmith arrived. David gathered some clothes, took a last look around, and left. The locksmith changed every lock in the house. I had new keys made, gave copies only to my parents and Lauren. I spent that evening cleaning, trying to erase Diane's destructive presence from my home. The damage was extensive, probably $10,000 worth when you counted the carpet, the destroyed clothes, the stolen items, the broken dishes and furniture. But I was back in my house, sleeping in my own bed, reclaiming my space. The relief was overwhelming. I took photos of everything, documented it all, sent copies to Margaret, who said this strengthened our case exponentially. Over the next week, David tried repeatedly to reconcile. He'd show up at my school, forcing me to have security, escort him off campus. He'd wait outside my house, trying to talk to me when I came home. He sent flowers, letters, emails, all full of apologies and promises. I forwarded everything to Margaret, got a protective order extension that covered him too. His mother, meanwhile, had apparently moved in with her sister in San Antonio, but was telling everyone in their church community that I'd cruelly thrown an elderly woman out on the street, that David was being manipulated by a gold-digging wife, that they needed prayers and support. I heard this from David's cousin, who reached out to tell me she believed me and was disgusted by Diane's behavior. The divorce proceeded quickly. Preston tried to argue for community property split on the house, but Judge Simmons ruled in my favor, declaring it my separate property based on the down payment evidence. David was ordered to sign a quitclaim deed, removing his name. He was awarded some furniture and personal items, but no equity in the house. Judge Simmons also ordered him to pay half the repair costs from Diane's rampage, which came to over $5,000. The divorce was finalized 4 months after Diane changed those locks, one of the fastest divorces in Dallas County that year. I kept my house, my dignity, and my freedom. But the legal victories were only part of the justice I got. Remember those charges I pressed for criminal mischief and theft? The district attorney pursued them. Diane was arrested 2 months after the incident, charged with felony criminal mischief over $10,000 because the total damage exceeded that threshold, plus theft. Her bail was set at $25,000. Her sister paid it, but Diane now had a criminal record and pending trial. Her attorney tried to negotiate a plea, but I refused to agree to anything less than full restitution and probation. The case is still pending, but her reputation in her San Antonio church community is destroyed. People who heard her victim story eventually learned the truth, saw the court documents, realized she'd lied. She's become a pariah. David's reputation suffered too. In the architecture community in Dallas, word spread about what happened. Clients don't want to work with someone who can't stand up to his mother, who let his wife be locked out of her own house. His firm quietly let him go 6 months after our divorce, citing concerns about his judgment and professionalism. Last I heard, he was working as a freelance draftsman, struggling financially, still living with his mother in San Antonio because he couldn't afford his own place. His mother got exactly what she wanted, her son all to herself, but in poverty and isolation rather than comfort. As for me, I got my peace back. I redecorated the house, erasing any trace of David or Diane. I painted over the spray-painted wall, replaced the carpet, bought new dishes, new furniture, made the space entirely mine. I threw a housewarming party, invited all my friends and family who'd supported me through the nightmare. I started dating again, slowly, cautiously, but with clear boundaries about family interference. I learned from this experience that love without boundaries isn't love. It's codependency, that a partner who won't protect you from their family isn't really a partner, that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who'll hurt you the worst. The redecoration process became therapeutic, a physical manifestation of reclaiming my life. I hired a professional painter who covered that awful red graffiti with 3 coats of primer and then a soft sage green that felt peaceful and new. I replaced the bleach-stained bedroom carpet with beautiful hardwood floors that I'd always wanted, but David had vetoed. I bought a new couch in a style I loved, modern and sleek, nothing like the traditional pieces David had preferred. I hung new art, pieces from local artists that spoke to me, that represented strength and renewal. I replaced every dish Diane had broken, but this time I chose patterns I genuinely loved, rather than the china pattern David's mother had suggested for our wedding registry. I bought new sheets, new towels, new everything that had been contaminated by her presence. I installed a security system with cameras, something I should have done from the beginning. I changed my Wi-Fi password, my garage code, every access point to my home. I even had the locks changed a second time, just to be absolutely certain neither David nor Diane had somehow kept a copy. The housewarming party was small but meaningful. My parents came, bringing champagne and so much pride in their eyes. Lauren brought her partner, who I'd grown close to during my stay with them. My coworkers from school came, the ones who'd supported me through the worst days when I'd come to work exhausted and emotionally drained. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly Korean woman who'd witnessed some of Diane's rampage and had been prepared to testify if needed, brought homemade kimchi and told me she was proud of me for fighting back. We toasted to new beginnings, to standing up for yourself, to the truth always coming to light eventually. Starting to date again was terrifying. I'd been so wrong about David, so blind to the red flags, that I questioned my judgment completely. My therapist, Dr. Sarah Morrison, who I'd started seeing immediately after the locks incident, helped me work through that fear. She helped me see that I hadn't been stupid or naive. I'd been trusting and hopeful, qualities that are good but need to be balanced with healthy skepticism and firm boundaries. She taught me warning signs to watch for, not just about mother-son relationships, but about partners who couldn't handle conflict, who avoided difficult conversations, who prioritized peace over justice. My first few dates were disasters, not because of the men, but because of me. I was hyper-vigilant, interrogating them about their family relationships, looking for any sign they might be another David. One poor guy mentioned he called his mom every Sunday, and I practically ran from the restaurant. But slowly, with Dr. Morrison's help, I learned to relax, to understand that healthy parent-child relationships in adulthood look different from what I'd experienced with David and Diane. I learned to ask better questions, to observe behavior patterns, to trust my instincts when something felt off. Looking back now, I can see all the red flags I missed or dismissed, the constant phone calls, the manufactured emergencies, the guilt trips, the way David always prioritized his mother's feelings over mine. I thought I was being understanding and compassionate, but I was actually enabling toxic behavior. I've learned to trust my instincts, to speak up when something feels wrong, to walk away from situations where I'm not respected. The experience was traumatic, but it taught me strength I didn't know I had. It showed me who my real support system was. It proved I could fight for myself and win. The red flags started before we were even engaged, if I'm honest with myself. The way David talked about his mother with this reverence that bordered on worship, never acknowledging any flaws or mistakes she'd made. The way he'd cancel plans with me if she called, no matter how last minute or trivial her need. The way he'd compare me to her, not favorably suggesting I should cook like her, clean like her, organize my life like her. I'd laughed it off, thinking he was just close with his mom, not recognizing it as the enmeshment it was. I've learned that enmeshment is different from closeness. Close families communicate regularly, support each other, share their lives while respecting boundaries. Enmeshed families can't tell where one person ends and another begins. David couldn't make decisions without consulting his mother. He couldn't have feelings she didn't validate. He couldn't imagine a future where she wasn't central to his daily life. That's not healthy closeness. That's emotional incest, a term my therapist used that made me uncomfortable at first, but perfectly described the dynamic. Diane had positioned herself as the primary woman in David's life, and I was always going to be secondary no matter what vows we exchanged. The guilt manipulation was perhaps the most insidious part. Every time I tried to set a boundary, Diane would remind David of her sacrifices. She'd worked 2 jobs to raise him, true, but she'd also made that choice. She'd given up dating to focus on him, but again, her choice. She'd moved to a smaller apartment to afford his college. Admirable, but not something he owed her his entire adult life for. The narrative she'd created was that David owed her everything, that he could never repay her sacrifices, that any woman who came into his life was taking him away from the debt he owed. It was toxic and manipulative, but David had been conditioned since childhood to believe it. I've learned since then that many mothers struggle with their sons growing up and getting married. It's natural to feel some loss when your child becomes independent. Healthy mothers work through those feelings in therapy or with friends. They build their own lives. They recognize that their job is to raise independent adults, not dependent children. Unhealthy mothers like Diane sabotage their sons' relationships, create dependency, ensure they'll never truly leave. The difference is profound and life-altering for everyone involved. The financial aspect of what happened still makes me angry. I'd saved $48,000 over 12 years for that down payment. That's $4,000 a year, over $300 a month, taken from paychecks that weren't large to begin with. I'd skipped vacations, bought used cars, packed lunches instead of eating out, all to build that savings. And Diane nearly stole it from me through her manipulation of David and the legal system. If I hadn't had excellent documentation, if Judge Simmons hadn't been fair, if Margaret hadn't been such a skilled attorney, I could have lost everything. That reality terrifies me because I know other women in similar situations who didn't have those advantages, who lost their homes and their savings to vindictive in-laws and weak partners. My students ask me sometimes why I don't have pictures of my wedding in my office anymore. I tell them that sometimes people we love disappoint us, and that's okay. It's part of life. What matters is how we respond, whether we accept mistreatment or stand up for ourselves. I use my experience, without sharing details, to help students dealing with toxic family dynamics, to teach them about healthy boundaries, to show them that adults face these challenges too and can overcome them. I never thought my personal crisis would make me better at my job, but it has. I see students every week who are dealing with controlling parents, enmeshed family systems, guilt manipulation, emotional abuse disguised as love. I recognize the signs now in ways I never could before experiencing it myself. I can gently point out unhealthy patterns, validate their feelings, help them understand that love should feel supportive, not suffocating. I teach them phrases to set boundaries, ways to protect their peace, resources for when family situations become unsafe. Some of my colleagues have commented that I've become much more effective at family counseling since my divorce, not knowing that my effectiveness comes from hard-won personal experience. The impact of this experience extends beyond just my romantic relationships and my career. It's changed how I view all my relationships, how I evaluate people's behavior, how I protect my energy and my peace. I'm more careful now about who I let into my life, but not in a closed-off way. I'm selective, intentional, watching for green flags as much as red flags. I value people who have healthy relationships with their families, who can set boundaries with love, who understand that caring about someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself for them. I've also become an advocate for clearer property laws and protections. What Diane did should have been addressed immediately by law enforcement, not dismissed as civil matter. Women shouldn't have to hire expensive attorneys and wait for court dates to regain access to their homes. I've written letters to state representatives, shared my story with local news outlets, connected with organizations working on these issues. I recently got engaged again to a wonderful man named Marcus, who I met at a school fundraiser. He's a pediatrician, divorced, with 2 kids who are amazing. When I told him my story on our 3rd date, preparing him for the baggage I carried, he said something that made me fall for him. He said any man who chooses his mother over his wife doesn't deserve either of them, that his job as a partner would be to build a life with me that respects our families but prioritizes our relationship. He introduced me to his mother early, a lovely woman who welcomed me warmly but made it clear she had her own life and friends and didn't need to be the center of her son's world. That's what healthy looks like. Marcus's mother, Patricia, was everything Diane wasn't. When Marcus first introduced us at a Sunday brunch, she hugged me genuinely, asked about my work with real interest, shared stories about Marcus as a child that were fond but not worshipful. She talked about her own life, her book club, her volunteer work at a food bank, her travel plans with her sister. She existed as a full person beyond just being Marcus's mother. When Marcus mentioned he was falling for me, Patricia smiled and said she was happy for him, that he deserved love after his difficult divorce, that she looked forward to getting to know me better but understood we needed space to build our relationship. The contrast was striking. Patricia called Marcus maybe twice a week, always at reasonable hours, and their conversations lasted maybe 20 minutes. She never manufactured emergencies. When she actually needed help, like when she had a minor medical procedure and needed a ride, she asked politely and thanked us profusely afterward. She sent me a birthday card on my birthday, thoughtful but not over the top, respecting that I had my own family and friends to celebrate with. She never criticized how I dressed, what I cooked, how I kept my house. She treated me like an autonomous adult who Marcus had chosen to partner with, not a competitor for his affection. Marcus's kids, Emma, who's 9, and Jackson, who's 7, were nervous about their dad dating, which was completely understandable. Their mother had remarried and moved to Austin, so they split time between households and worried about being forgotten. I took it slow with them, never trying to replace their mother, just being a steady, kind presence. I helped Emma with her math homework using my teaching skills, took Jackson to soccer practice when Marcus had emergencies at the hospital, listened when they wanted to talk, and gave them space when they didn't. After 6 months, Emma told Marcus she was glad he'd met me, that I was nice and didn't try to be fake. Coming from a 9-year-old who'd been through parental divorce, that was high praise. Marcus proposed on the anniversary of the day we met, exactly 1 year later. We were back at the same school fundraiser watching students present their projects, and he got down on one knee right there in the cafeteria. Emma and Jackson were there, holding a sign that said, "Will you marry us?" And I cried happy tears, the kind I thought I'd never cry again after David. Patricia was there too, smiling and clapping, genuinely joyful for us, secure enough in her relationship with her son to welcome me into their family. That's the difference, I realized, between a mother who raised a son to be independent and one who raised him to be dependent. Planning this wedding has been completely different from planning with David. Marcus has opinions and expresses them, doesn't just defer to what his mother thinks. We make decisions together, compromising when we disagree, laughing through the stress. Patricia offers suggestions when asked, but respects our choices when we go different directions. She's excited to be involved, but doesn't need to control everything. Emma and Jackson are going to be in the wedding party, and they're so excited they talk about it constantly. We're building a blended family based on mutual respect, clear communication, and healthy boundaries. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. If you're in a situation where a family member is overstepping, where your partner won't set boundaries, where you feel erased in your own life, please know you deserve better. It's not selfish to protect yourself, to demand respect, to walk away from toxicity. I hope my experience helps someone else recognize the warning signs earlier than I did, to act faster, to not waste years trying to appease people who will never be satisfied. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more stories of survival, justice, and reclaiming your power. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let me know if you've dealt with difficult in-laws and how you handled it. Your engagement helps this channel reach more people who need to hear these stories. Until next time, remember that you are worthy of respect. Your boundaries matter, and sometimes the best revenge is simply living well.